In 3. You're live. Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I am your presenter, Becky Denese. Welcome to our new streaming time of Friday afternoon at 2:15 p.m. I hope you are all well. As you can see, we're now streaming in the shop again, but this is sort of like a start of a whole new evolution of us streaming in the shop every Friday. Hopefully you can all hear me fine and everything. Looks like we've got a few people here. It does feel like a Thursday. I'm very confused about what day of the week it is. Time no longer has any meaning for me whatsoever, and you're probably the same. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk about cameras. This is a subject I talk about a lot, but I thought it would be quite useful, and some of you have already, I was just scanning through the comments, some of you have already said, my camera will probably outlive me, so I won't upgrade. Well, I wanted to talk to you about why you should or shouldn't upgrade, as the case may be. Sadly, buying a new camera doesn't always make you a better photographer. A lot of people think that, but there are reasons to upgrade and there are reasons to stick with what you've got. So I wanted to talk about some of the kind of nitty-gritty details of why you would upgrade or why you would keep your existing camera and try and get the most out of it that you possibly can. So this is potentially not a sales pitchy stream at all. It's more of a kind of practical, if you're thinking of buying a new camera, what do you want to look out for? Or if you've been contemplating a new camera but you're not sure if you need one, I'm going to give you some reasons why you might not need one. Don't tell anyone that I'm not selling you anything. So just before I forget, if you're not a subscriber, I think pretty much everyone that I can see on the comments here is already subscribed. But if you are not a subscriber, please do subscribe. If you want to contribute to the coffee fund, you can do by pressing the little $sign. I must always say it. And thank you to everyone. I just also want to say thank you to everyone who joined us from the very first stream to where we are now. Because when we first started streaming in the shop, we didn't know what we were doing. At all. It was more of a kind of let's push a button and see what happens sort of thing. Oh, I got flashed at. And those of you that did join when we had 5 or 6 people in our little group, well, some of you are still here even today, so thank you. And thank you to everyone who's joined since, because it really does make my day to know that people find this interesting and helpful, and that you're keeping me company as much as I'm keeping you company. So, I just realised you can see the microphone in shot. I'm keeping it reasonably close because I want to make sure you can hear me. So first, I'm going to talk about something that you probably know a bit about, the difference between FX and DX. Obviously, FX is generally considered a professional size sensor. That means that the sensor is the same size as a piece of film. DX is the original technology that we had when Nikon first kind of started mass producing digital cameras. At that time, it wasn't cost effective or practical to produce full frame cameras. So most of the digital cameras that we saw on the market until about 2008 were all DX cameras. So for a long time, professionals were using DX as well as amateurs and everyone in between. I, in fact, started learning digital photography with a D100. And that was, I can't remember how many megapixels it was, not very many. It was like 4 or maybe 6. And the D100, in fact, I've got one in this cupboard somewhere. Let me find it. I'll just lean to shut. The D100, you won't necessarily be able to easily see. It does look very Nikon. The Z6 has now realised there's no face in the frame, so it's not trying to focus on me, which is good. But it had this different kind of dial on the top. So on the top, and also, let's just check out the size of that little rear LCD there. Very, very little. The D100 was a great starter camera, but it had a lot of limitations. I very quickly outgrew it and went for a D200. So the D200 was my camera for a long, long time. A lot of you won't necessarily have started with something as kind of big as this. You might have started with a small entry-level DSLR, the D40, the D60, the D3000 or 5000 series. They look a little bit like this. They're a bit smaller in the hand, as you can see. I'm going to talk about sensors and processors and stuff, but I just wanted to show you the kind of differences there. So let me just show you very quickly a lot of you will have seen this. I should actually just have some shortcuts. You done? So this is the difference between an FX and a DX size sensor. The FX, this is actually off the Nikon website, but as you can see, this image here shows you what you get if you were taking a picture with the same lens on a DX and an FX camera, and how much you crop out by having a DX camera. Now, there is a slight misconception that you can't really shoot wide angle on DX sensors. That's not strictly true. Obviously, with this crop factor that you get here, a lot of people talk about the 1.5 crop. Just to explain that for anybody that doesn't know, if you're shooting with a lens on a full frame camera, and then you take that same lens and you put it on a DX camera, you obviously get this smaller area coverage. It doesn't actually zoom in your lens, it's just cropping for you when you're taking the picture, because you're missing out all this extra stuff that the glass could fit in. So that's why when you get for example, a 50mm full frame lens on a DX camera, we say that it's going to be 75mm, because we times that by 1.5, just so that we understand that we're not getting the full coverage of 50mm, we're actually cropping a little bit. So that's why we talk about the 1.5 crop factor. I will show you some pictures from some DX cameras, because I didn't go full frame probably until 2012, I think, when the D700 started to become very cheap. So before that, I used DX cameras. DX cameras are more than enough for most people to do things with. Why is it beneficial to have an FX camera? Yes, you get that sort of wider field of view, but really there are no DX lenses that go any less wide than full frame lenses. So the kind of perception that you can't get a wide angle on a DX camera is wrong. You just have to have the right lenses for it. Just to debunk any myths, these DX lenses, which say DX on them, you still have to apply the 1.5 crop factor. So this little kit lens, for example, which frequently comes with these D3000, 5000 series cameras, and also the D40 and the D60, although they say 18 to 55 on them, they are actually 27 to, do the maths, 83-ish millimeter, something like that. So that's the actual effective field of view that you get, even though it says 18 to 55 on it. Nikon basically wrote all of their focal lengths on their DX lenses in what it would be if it were a full frame lens. That's very confusing, but but hopefully that makes sense. Before I start diving into the differences on sensors, I'm just going to have a very quick look at the comments. Here we go. Well, yes, depending on your time zone, this might be a new standard time for you, depending on where you are in the world. But 2:15 in the UK, Greenwich Mean Time, and whatever the time is for you. We're going to try and keep it as fixed to Friday afternoons as we possibly can. I'm not sat on the floor. I'm sat on a chair, but the count is quite high, and I didn't want to stand up for a full hour. I think when I first did the stream in the shop, I stood up for the full hour, and I regretted it. So I'm sitting down at a very low chair. D100 6 megapixels, there you go. D80, D90, D70. So all of these little cameras were great. In fact, when Nikon first kind of expanded their range, obviously we had the D1, that was a DX sensor. That was like the first professional body, D1, D1X. Alongside that, we had the D100. And then shortly after, we had the D40, which was entry level, like really, really entry level, 6 megapixels as well, I believe. And then they did a D40X, which was 10 megapixels. And then they just created a D60. So you might have had any of those cameras. The D40 and the D60 are like these little bodies, D3000, 5000 size. They're just the predecessors. D100 series has been quite logical in its numbering. It went D100, 200, 300, then we waited what felt like half a century, but was actually probably about 8 years, and then we got the D500, which is still a current camera, all from the same kind of genus, let's say, as the D100. Then if you had a D1, it went D1, D1X, D2, D2X, D2XS, D2H was in the middle there somewhere, which had a very super high frame rate. And then we got our full frame bodies, D3, D3S, D3X, D4, etc., D5, and now the D6. So all of those things have kind of been fairly logical in their progression. I will talk about things like the D700 and stuff later, just as a slight aside. If I don't mention your personal camera that you own, it's nothing personal. When I did the film body stream, someone said, "I can't believe you didn't talk about my F301." Like, I don't have any experience with it. That was the only reason why I didn't mention it. And also I didn't have one here to show people. It's not a personal slight if I don't mention your specific camera. It's just that either I don't have it here or I haven't used it, so I can't comment much on it. Okay, so just to clarify what Andy says, the DX lenses, you can still tell the body, if you put, let's say I take this 1855 and I'm going to put it on a full frame camera. The camera, the full frame body, so let's just say D810, because I've got one here. So if I take this 1855 and I put it on the D810, it is going to crop automatically. But on DSLRs, you can turn that crop factor off. It does mean that you will get some vignetting. I've talked about this in the earlier stream. So you will see a little bit of black around the outside. With the Z cameras, you can't turn the DX crop factor, the automatic one, off. Just to clarify that, but you can. So for example, Andy, in your case, if you wanted to put a DX lens on a full frame camera, you can choose what size of frame you use. You just will find that the DX lenses don't necessarily cover the full sensor. All right, so now we understand the difference between the sizes of DX and FX cameras. What does that really mean in terms of sensor quality? So the sensors on the DX cameras, obviously, if you've got a very high resolution sensor, it does mean that in a very small space, it's really trying to pack in the megapixels. That used to mean that you didn't get very good light trapping capabilities. I wished I had a demonstration of this. Actually, someone asked me to demonstrate it once and draw it out on a piece of paper. But if you essentially imagine this piece of paper here as your sensor, with a DX sensor, which is, let's say, a bit smaller, with 24 megapixels, those pixels are going to be like crammed into that space. Whereas with a full frame sensor, with the same number of megapixels, they're going to be much more spread out. You can have bigger pixels. That just means that it has a slightly better chance of capturing light. And that's why we tend to think that full frame cameras are better in low light than DX cameras. It's not always the case. Going to talk about generations of processors and things that handle noise and stuff as well in a minute. But let's talk about resolution of sensors. So a lot of people have had cameras with lower resolution, so they'll know the differences between using, say, 6 or 10 or 12 megapixels versus using 24, 36, or now we've got 45 in the D850 and the Z7. Pixels and resolution aren't everything. I'm just going to say that before we start, because a lot of people think, and not usually photographers, but non-photographers tend to think that the more pixels, the better. So when they buy their latest Huawei phone or whatever, or Sony phone, and it has 50 megapixels in this tiny, tiny little sensor, it usually means that it's going to be very, very bad in low light, or it's going to need a lot of stuff under the hood to fix the noise. So I will talk about D700 and D750 and the benefits of low light on full frame cameras as well. I've got a plan for that. Yeah, exactly. As Andy says, like a sieve, more holes or smaller holes, more light getting in. If you think that water is like light, then you can imagine a sieve which has smaller holes is going to have less passage of light going through. It's going to take longer for that light to get through. So you would need longer exposures, for example, to get the same amount of light onto the sensor than if you were using a full frame camera, which has nice big holes or nice big megapixels to absorb all that light. There is another factor to light absorption, which is the image processor. The image processor is like the brain. If you imagine that the sensor is like the eyes of the body, then the processor is the thing that then takes that image and turns it into a final picture. So the processors are very important. And I talk about, oh, it's got a new processor. I get very excited when Nikon develop new processors. We're now on XP 6, which is a fantastic processor. But we've had certain generations of processor which have been so much better than the previous ones. I will talk about that as well. I've got a couple of little grids to show you, and what I'll do is leave them up on the screen enough so that if you do want to watch this back later and you want to have a look at some of the more nitty gritty, you know, what processor went with what camera and stuff like that, you can just pause the video afterwards so that you can see them. Oh, Mike, you're 12 minutes late. Never mind. We're going to talk about sensors now. So the benefits of high versus low resolution sensors, apart from the light trapping capabilities, obviously, if you've got a sensor which has lots and lots of pixels on it, if it's a good quality sensor, it usually means that you can crop a bit more, or if, like Andy mentioned, you want to use a DX lens on a full frame body, it's not then the end of the world if you get that crop factor, because you've still got lots of resolution to play with. I used to use a D700 for weddings, and I would crop quite aggressively sometimes if I was only able to take a couple of lenses with me, particularly if it was like a friend's wedding or something like that and I wasn't the main photographer. I might take a 24mm and an 85mm and then just play with the pictures afterwards and crop as I needed. The D700 had 12 megapixels, but it also had an incredible processor. It was X-Speed 3, which was kind of the new generation of high low light performance sensors, which Paul was mentioning, or someone was mentioning. The D700 is very good in low light. The D750 is a confusing one. I'm going to talk about that. That came after the D700, but a lot of people, because of the build and shape of it, didn't consider it an upgrade to the D700. In terms of image quality, it certainly was, but there were some things missing that meant that maybe it wouldn't be used as a professional body. I've used both for weddings quite happily and never had a problem with it, but you know, it's not necessarily considered a go-to pro camera, but it is very, very good in low light. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very, very, very much. I haven't got my cup yet, the little ice cream cup that I wanted to put. I didn't have time in amongst everything else to actually get that set up. I will have it for next week's stream. Right, so another benefit to having high resolution sensor apart from the crop factor is obviously that then you can print bigger. Not everybody wants to print billboard size, but if you did, then you could probably do it with something that was above 24 megapixels. These days, if you are shooting for a magazine or a media company or anything like that, in fact, even newspapers who don't necessarily print in high quality will still ask for full frame pictures. They actually prefer the submitting photographer to use a full frame camera, even if they're never going to print to that standard or that level. So the full frame cameras, you can not just full frame, DX as well, but with full frame you have a tendency to be able to print bigger. With the D850, for example, and even the D810 and the D800s, you could literally print a picture and stick it on the side of a bus if you wanted to. You could put it on the side of a building, that literally billboard size. Anyone who has been in the shop will have seen a picture of Central Park taken from a helicopter, which is on our wall as you come in. So when you come into the shop, if you turn left, you've got a big photo which is printed. I would call that, I mean, I don't actually know how many inches it is, but I would call it maybe A0 size, something like that. That shot was taken with a D300. So that's 12 megapixels on a DX sensor. So you don't have to have loads and loads of resolution in order to print very big. It does help. It's not necessary, particularly if your pictures are not going to be viewed close up. So that picture of Central Park, apart from being taken from a moving helicopter and being taken on a D300 and then being blown up, if you stand right next to it, you can see it's not, you know, you can't see every leaf on the trees in Central Park. But you don't need to, because the picture itself is so impressive and you're usually going to view it from a few feet away that it doesn't matter. So for exhibition purposes, think about what size you're going to print, think about what you want to do with your pictures after. If you're a little bit like me and don't process your pictures very much aside from basic raw processing and maybe the odd bit of cropping here and there, then you probably won't need to worry about the huge amount of data that you get. I use a D850. I don't need a D850, but I work at Grace Westminster. So I really couldn't, after so many years with my D750. I had my D750 for 5 years and I used it to death. And when it was time for an upgrade, the D850 was the logical choice for me. But I don't need that resolution. 24 megapixels is more than enough for what I do. A0 is the size house plans are printed. I've never had to print house plans, Andy, but thank you. So in terms of bit rate, I don't remember, because obviously it was quite a long time ago. It was when I had a D700, so we're talking almost more than 10 years ago. But generally I try and shoot at 14-bit RAW. Don't know if the D700 had 14-bit RAW. I'd have to look it up. I don't have a D700 here, unfortunately. But bitrate and shooting RAW definitely helps. So if you've got a lower resolution camera and you just want to get the most out of it, do shoot RAW. Shoot at the highest bit depth of RAW that you possibly can. So usually with modern cameras, 14-bit is the standard. And that way you'll get more bang for your buck, if you like, in terms of what comes out of your camera in terms of the picture and the size of the picture. That will give you the biggest file possible. A lot of us these days are shooting with high resolution cameras and maybe downsizing the pictures a bit because they accumulate hard drive space. This is another problem with high resolution sensors. You do end up with very, very big pictures. The D850, thanks Paul. It's good to have someone on hand who's got a camera that I'm talking about. So the D850, for example, in full uncompressed 14-bit RAW, the pictures come out over 100 megabytes per RAW file. That, as you will all know from having experienced my technical difficulties, how much that would wreck my big computer at home. Luckily, I had lots of external hard drives to help store all that stuff. But certainly I was much happier with the file size of the D750. You can do things like downsizing. You can shoot in smaller RAW sizes. It compromises things a bit. So if you are stuck with higher resolution sensors, it's not the end of the world. But it's just to give you a solution, let's say, if you don't have a high resolution sensor. So that's sensors. Now let's talk about processors properly. So I'm just going to show you some pictures just to break it up a bit so that you've got a view of what it looks like to shoot on a DX versus an FX camera. Actually, let me also show you if I can find it. Did it save it for me? Yes, it did. Fantastic. Okay, let me switch over my screen here just so that you can see. This is a screen that if you want to, you can later on watch back and pause the video so that you can have a proper look at this. This is a grid that I actually made based off information that I got from Nikon's website and from Wikipedia and all kinds of places. Just so that I could very quickly see what lenses work with what cameras and also what processors went into what cameras. So the X-Speed processor, as I talked about before, is a Nikon proprietary technology. They created the X-Speed processor. This is the thing that kind of gave them the cutting edge between Canon when it came to low light performance. Canon used their own processors, Nikon used X-Speed. Doesn't matter where the sensor's made. Most people know that Sony make Nikon sensors. That's, by the by. The processor is the thing that takes the image off the sensor and turns it into the final picture. So if we have a look at this time frame here, we've got X-Speed, basically X-Speed 1, or the first X-Speed processor, around the D300 time. X-Speed 2 came out in 2010 with the D7000 and 3100. I'm going to show you some pictures from that in a minute. X-Speed 3 was also, I don't have the full frame cameras on this grid because this is just the DX ones, but X-Speed 3 was kind of next real revolution in terms of low light capabilities, because the processor does a lot of the low light noise processing. X-Speed 4 here with 7200, D5500, and now X-Speed 5, most of the cameras produced from 2016 up until the Zs came out were X-Speed 5. This obviously I made before X-Speed 6 came out. X-Speed 6 is the processor that goes into the Z cameras, the D850, and let me think, what else? The Z50, D7500, 5600, actually I'd have to double check that one, the little cameras, but I believe they all take the same processor, which means that the low light handling on all of those more recent cameras is going to be very, very similar. Now let me just show you some pictures. So this is just to give you an idea. If I do it in the right sequence, that would help. There we go. So this is just to give you an idea of what you can achieve even without high-resolution sensors. A lot of you will have better pictures than this on your hard drive at home, I'm sure. But just to get, I have a very specific style of photographs. This is a D200. A couple of shots from the D200. usually just using a standard lens or an 18-200. That was kind of my go-to travel around lens at the time. I upgraded to the D300, slightly nicer, at higher ISOs between 800 and 1000. I wouldn't push it above that personally. Also D300 shot there. So with the generations of the upgrades, you find that you can actually shoot at lower light at higher ISOs without too much noise. The D200 shots that I showed you there, if I just get back to them, these are both taken in really good light. I have some very, very noisy pictures which were taken around the time of, you know, evening time and stuff like that. I wouldn't go higher than 800 ISO for those. So here's the D300 ones, and then this is the D3100. For those of you that don't know, this is Gary Barlow. It's my mate. I actually took the D3100 into Wembley back when you were allowed to take your proper cameras to places, and I found that I could actually not only sneak that in with an 18-200, but I got some very, very impressive for me shots on the D3100. Actually, the whole set of photos was fantastic. But I just thought I'd show you two. There's Robbie Williams as Gary Barlow. I am a Take That fan, for anyone wondering. All right, so 3100, that's those shots. Now let's see if it will give me. No, it won't. It wants to make me. This is the problem. I'm much more au fait with Max. So this is a shot with the D7100. So that came slightly after the D3100, back when cameras followed a sequence in terms of numbering. 7000, 7100 were very, very good DX cameras. The 7100 was actually, the sensor was made by Toshiba, for anyone who's interested in that. So it was a slightly different sensor to what we were used to seeing, and because it was the first kind of entry into 24 megapixels, Nikon was starting to use these higher resolution sensors around this time. But even with the little D3100, I got really what I would consider very impressive results. So you, as I say, you don't necessarily need to have the big cameras to take shots that you might be happy with. I do have some FX examples as well, but I thought I would just show those to you before I proceed to talk about processors. I'm just going to have a very quick look. Oh, getting some echoes. Maybe my microphone is... Can you get the USB cable for the microphone? Sure. Gonna... While we're recording, actually, see if we can fix it. It might be that the microphone's just running out of battery. It usually causes a bit of an echo. Do you want to get the... Okay. I will talk a bit more, and we'll see if that fixes it. You tell me if it fixes it at all. That must be... Yeah, I reckon that it's a battery thing, though. If you get the USB cable, I'll plug it in while I'm talking. Let me know if there is... an echo. How weird. Okay, it's always good to have someone reading the comments while I'm talking away. Yeah, so for example, Lady Dog has two D810s. No need to swap over to the D850. If you don't need 45 megapixels, I completely agree. I wonder, don't know why there is an odd echo. I'm just trying to see anyone else. Let me know if the echo has gone away, or from me not showing my screen, or if it fixes by being with me. I don't know how to fix that otherwise, but I will try and charge the... Okay, so it must be a setting. Thanks, David. That was all I was waiting for. Must be a setting when I've got the screen sharing on. I'm pretty sure I copied the settings along, but you know, it seems... It seems like there's always something, right? Okay, well, you're going to look at my face now, so that's not going to be so bad. Okay, so apart from processors, it's the screen sharing settings, so that's fine. I will fix that while I'm sharing my screen next time I do that. So the processor is very important for low light performance, but also for things like your picture controls. When you've got Z cameras or any of the newer cameras that have in-camera, let's say aberration controls, distortion control, all that kind of stuff, all of that information gets packed into the processor. So it's the processor that takes that picture that the sensor shot and then turns it into your final picture. This is why I find knowing what processor is in the camera is very, very important. I think that ideally, if you are in an older generation of processors and you feel like your camera is lacking somewhere, then that's the first thing to look for in an upgrade, not necessarily just the sensor, because the sensor is a personal thing. If you don't need to print your pictures very big, you don't need more resolution. If you do want bigger blow-ups, bigger file sizes to play with, stuff like that, then obviously take the sensor resolution into account as well. All right, so now let's talk about AF systems. There's been an echo all stream. I think it's the battery. Do you mind passing me the charging cable? Let's see if that fixes it. It's the USB 3. Looks like the one. Excuse me, one moment, please, while I find the thingy. There it is. I'm so technical. Like, I am actually very technical, but not when I'm in the middle of a live stream. Okay, is it on blue? Yeah, okay. Let's see if that fixes it. I'm sorry if I just deafened you all by laughing while you're playing the microphone. Hopefully that will fix it. Let me just have a quick look at my mic settings. Yeah, I see.
How's that? Make it stop. Okay, they're saying make it stop. Has it stopped?
Yeah, that's stopped now.
I'm just going to wait for them to catch up. Anyway, so essentially all the things that we could have done wrong, we did wrong, and we learnt the hard way. And now the course that I did has made me discover that. Hopefully that has fixed the buzzing. Have you got your headphones? Can you hear it? Better. Phew. Okay, everybody's saying yes. The latency on YouTube Live is about 20 to 30 seconds, which is why, yeah, there we go, which is why I have to wait for you to comment so that I know what's going on. Everybody says it's better. Thank goodness for that. All right, shall we carry on? Right, so I have talked about low light performance, processors, sensors. Let's talk about AF systems. Obviously, with every generation of camera, a new autofocus system usually comes out. Sometimes you'll have one development of autofocus system, and then that will carry through to the DX bodies and the FX bodies, all in that same kind of generation of bodies. So not only do you potentially want to look at your processor and your sensor, but also have a look at the AF system being used. Sometimes people will say, oh, Nikon didn't put more focusing points in this camera. Usually if they've upgraded a camera but they haven't put more points in, it's because the system itself has improved, and so more points are not necessary. For example, the D600, D610, the focusing system was slightly improved. Mostly that was actually a fix for the dust on the shutter. Some people call it oil on the shutter, but that kind of mechanism where some factory debris had been left in the shutter mechanism, and so they had to actually just either replace the shutters or they had to replace the cameras altogether. So then they made the D610. The D600 had such bad press, it was just easier for them to do that, believe it or not. I actually had a D600. I loved it to pieces. The only reason I changed to the D750 was because in broad daylight, the difference between the 600 and the 750 was negligible. In fact, it wasn't even noticeable at all. In low light, that was where we found that we would get a better performance from the D750. New processor, basically. But it also had a faster autofocus system. Sorry, would you mind shutting that door? Thank you. We are very much in a live shop environment, as you can tell. So people walk past and make noises and stuff. So I would have a look at the autofocus system if you are thinking of an upgrade. If you're not doing sports and wildlife, if you tend to shoot static subjects, or you're shooting manual focus with manual focus lenses, don't worry about it. John has just mentioned using manual focus. Yeah, exactly. So some people will prefer to use manual focus anyway. If you're not doing fast moving stuff, then it's not going to make a huge difference to you whether or not it's got 51 points or 153 points or 275 points or whatever they're up to now. So only worry about it really if it's affecting the performance of your photography, and if you're doing things like birds in flight or wildlife or sports or like fast moving action, as Rob was talking about the other day with the D6. The main concentration of that camera is on fast moving subjects. You wouldn't necessarily buy a D6 if you're shooting landscape. There is no point. So that's the AF system for you. I've talked about low light performance. Just one mention between the DX and FX cameras. So some people will obviously have bought a D500. The D500 is very, very good in low light. And is the little brother to the D5 really. So if you want similar performance to a D5, it won't shoot at 10,000 ISO and be amazing. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that if you want a DX camera with the best possible low light performance, look at the DX cameras. Even the D5600 is very good. D7500 is very good, and D500. They all have the same insides. It's just the form factor of the body is different. So if you are looking at a DX camera, you want an upgrade and you're not really sure which one to go for, any of those three are great. I'm not going to talk about the differences between mirrorless and DSLRs in this stream necessarily. I mean, because we're more talking about picture quality than anything else. If you want a Z camera, then you're looking at changing your entire system, including probably a lot of your lenses. So that's a talk for another day. but certainly if you do want to shoot in low light and you want to stick with the DX sensor because you've got lots of DX lenses, for example, or you like the crop factor, and you just find that maybe your older camera is a bit disappointing in low light, then look at the newer ones. They are much better. You don't have to go full frame necessarily. I kind of say that the 500 and the 7000, particularly the more recent 7000 series cameras, have slightly blurred the lines a little bit between DX and FX for low light performance. So that potentially gives you an idea there of what I think about the low light performance on those. When it comes to full frame cameras, so I am going to show you some pictures. I'm going to have to figure out what I've done to the audio when I do that. So leave it with me for one moment while I get the pictures ready. This is not a history of what Becky uses, but let me just find the... Okay, there shouldn't be an echo there. I don't have two things going at the same time. You can see my screen. I've just got the one. Hopefully you don't get too much of an echo when I show you this now. If you do, I'm sorry, I'll make it quick. So I was using the D4S for concerts and weddings. This is in St. James, Piccadilly. But you might recognize the setting, you might not if you haven't been there before. It is very, very low light there. This was a winter evening concert and I was shooting sometimes at 8,000 ISO and it was painful. So the D4S, as someone mentioned earlier, is excellent for low light performance. If I had been shooting with a DX camera or one of my older bodies, I can assure you the pictures would have probably turned out completely mushy. So there we go. This is a D600. This is broad daylight, obviously. This is just a dragonfly and not taken with a particularly sophisticated lens. It was taken with the 24-120 f4, which is a kit lens. This is another D600 shot with the 21.8 in Paris. This is also Paris, a D600 I took around with me a lot. I took it to places where I really wanted to kind of savor the moment. Unfortunately, Windows opened my pictures out of sequence and I didn't have time to try and correct it. But this was with the D700. So as I say, I have a very specific style of photography. I like taking pictures of butterflies and flowers. You'll see a lot of that here. The D700 was my camera it was my jump from DX to FX. So I had the D5100 and then I took the leap to the D700. I'll explain why I did that in a minute. But so this is a wedding shot. Again, this was it wasn't one of the shots from an official photography viewpoint. This was one of my friends getting married, taken with the 24 2.8D. Also D700, so you can see some macro shots there. Then after the D700, I briefly had the D600, then the D750. This was taken at 5600 ISO. I did have a little bit of this is a perspective control, as you can tell from the depth of field control there, but 5600 ISO, it still produced very clean shots considering how low light it was in that studio. This is D750 also. Again, D750, and I actually can't remember. This was about 2500 ISO, and I think if I can just zoom in a little bit, you can see 2500 ISO, the noise is still very pleasing. It's not hideous at all. I do find that sometimes when you shoot at those high ISO levels, you do get quite an ugly looking shot. Let's just one more time. Oh, that's apparently the last photo of that set. Hopefully you didn't get too much echo when I was showing you that stuff. No? Okay, good. Perfect sound. Fantastic. I don't know what was going on there. So the reason that I went from D200, D300 to the smaller little bodies like this was because Nikon were actually putting such good sensors in these little cameras that there was no need for me at the time. There was no upgrade to the D300, first of all. And second of all, there was no need for me to take the jump into full frame really until I started doing lots and lots of weddings and concerts, at which point it became a must for the low light performance. But generally speaking, for day-to-day stuff, for travel, for family shots and things like that, these smaller cameras are fantastic. Now, I will just mention the ergonomics of these things, because these little cameras don't have everything on the outside. You do have to look at the slightly bigger bodies so that you've got your aperture control on the front and your shutter control on the back. With these little cameras, you tend to have to, well, with the aperture control, you've got to push a button and turn the dial. And then if you want to do things like change your ISO or your quality or your white balance or anything, you have to dive into the menus, which I find very, very frustrating. So when you want everything at your fingertips, if that is important to you and you've got a smaller camera, then looking at a slightly bigger camera is logical. You don't have to go for the latest and greatest. Any of these cameras that I've shown you shots from, any of the shots, I mean, obviously our little group here has a massive amount of talent, so you can go in and anyone who has put the specs of their pictures kindly, you'll be able to see what can be achieved with lower resolution cameras, with older cameras. A lot of the shots that I took with my D200 were some of my favourite shots, in fact. Obviously, I compare them to shots that I take now, and pictures are very little in comparison, but they were, particularly in broad daylight, I liked the colour rendition. I liked how there was less colour information, so perhaps things popped a bit more. It wasn't necessarily true to real life, but I liked the pictures very much. Now, so before you upgrade, there's a few things you should ask yourself, I would say. The first one really to ask yourself is, does the camera that you have already do everything that you need it to? If you've got your body and you find that generally you're very happy with the image quality and it's not making you miss shots or anything like that, you probably don't need to upgrade just yet. But then ask yourself something else. Have you learned everything you know about your existing camera, or have you outgrown it? Because a lot of people will upgrade thinking that their existing body isn't good enough, but they don't actually know their way around their existing camera enough to really say whether or not they should have an upgrade. I take, for example, someone who upgraded from a D600 to a D850. That's not a bad upgrade, but actually they were shooting on auto the entire time with the D600. So the D850 wasn't really going to get them any better shots. It was just going to pack in a load more resolution. And I will mention why that is not necessarily a good thing. So if you've outgrown your camera, if you've got, for example, a little camera like this, I often see students start with these bodies and then they reach a level where they need something more. Let's say they need studio flash compatibility, or they need higher quality movie capability, or they need to shoot in more low light, they need higher frames per second, better autofocus system, da-di-da-di-da. All those things are important. And if you need that, then yes, you wouldn't be able to, there's only so much you can learn on a camera of this size before you do need to upgrade. The last thing I would say is to ask yourself, will the upgraded camera allow you to take photos that you're not currently able to get? So if you are finding that you're missing shots, as I said before, like for example with sequences of birds in flight or dancers or sports photography, if you're missing photos and you think, actually, this camera would allow me to do this. Or, as Andy mentioned, limiting your ISO, for example. If your camera doesn't shoot at higher ISOs, sometimes that will stop you from getting a shot that you might have gotten if you had a different body. So when I shot with the D200, I discovered that one day I had accidentally managed to change my settings to JPEG basic, and I couldn't then do anything with that picture because it came out horrendously grainy or sort of pixelated when I started to manipulate it. If I'd been shooting with a D850, which didn't exist then, but if I had and I'd been shooting on JPEG basic by accident, I could have done a lot more with that photo, which I couldn't do because the D200 had limited me. So that's another question to ask you. Those are really the three main things I would say. Does your camera do everything you need it to? Do you already know everything that your camera can do? And does the new camera that you're thinking of upgrading to give you something that you don't already have? Does it allow you to take pictures that you can't already take with your existing kit? It might just be that you need a little bit more education on some element of the camera that you've got rather than investing in the new one. There are other things as well, of course, like focus stacking and focus peaking and all these things that I rave about on the D850 and also the Z cameras, and that also exist on the D780, D5, D500. Those newer bodies do have a lot of features packed into them. So if that's the kind of thing that you want to do, then of course by all means upgrade, because that's your only route to those certain features. But if you've got a camera that you're otherwise very happy with and you can find solutions or ways around that, for example, you can manually focus stack, don't have to have the camera do it for you, or AF fine tuning, you don't have to do that automatically, you can do that manually, stuff like that. Then you can obviously get away with just sticking with your body and upgrading in some nice glass instead. A lot of people say, you know, invest in the lenses, not in the camera bodies. That is true for a lot of cases. If you are shooting, for example, in my situation where I was shooting in very, very low light concerts, usually classical concerts, so you cannot make noise and you cannot use flash, no, then having a body which will either shoot silently in live view, that was an absolute godsend, and also being very, very capable in low light, those things were a must for me. If I hadn't been doing a lot of that work, I probably didn't need to upgrade my D700 for a long time. So I would say those things. There's other things to consider, like will your lenses work? Let's just talk about high resolution. I know I'm very conscious of the time and I do want to read your comments, but I do also want to talk about resolution. So if you've got a high resolution camera, or if you suddenly, I remember when the D800 came out, people flooded to buy the D800 and the D800E and then suddenly said, oh, my pictures are not sharp anymore. Well, it's probably because you're using glass that is 20 years old, or you are shooting at shutter speeds that are too slow. I have talked about that before. If you have a very high resolution sensor, and that does also apply to DX, but more so to FX, it's more obvious, then you will need to have pretty good technique in order to get the best of the best out of your camera. If you buy something which has 36 megapixels, I'd say anything above 24 really, then you do start needing to look at the more modern glass. You kind of need to make sure that you're not shooting at slow shutter speeds. I personally don't shoot with the D850 ideally below 100th of a second, and you know me, I tend to use manual focus lenses, but you do get the best quality if you're shooting with the modern glass with all of those modern coatings on them, which are designed to handle things that those higher resolution sensors pick up. If you've got 12 megapixels, this is why the D700 was so popular. 12 megapixels is like the dream sensor. You can be as rubbish as you like and it won't show you any flaws. Your lens could be ancient and have fungus in it and you wouldn't be able to see it on the pictures, because the 12 megapixel sensor was just that sweet spot in terms of resolution and quality without demanding too much of the photographer. As soon as we started to get up into the higher realms of resolution, people started realizing that maybe they needed to upgrade their lenses or they needed to sharpen their technique a little bit. So do also think about that. If you have a camera and you've got lots of old AFD type lenses, they are lovely lenses, but with a D850 or a D800 series camera, you're going to see things like chromatic aberration. You're going to see potentially diffraction at wider apertures than you would with a non-N nanocrystal coated G lens, for example. You may also it will pick up the flaws in the glass more than if you were using a more modern lens. Paul says that's why the D700 works for me. Yeah, I mean, I love the D700. Honestly, I could have, if Nikon had maybe just upgraded it directly, I would have gone that route instead. They did a little hop. D700, then D600, which was not really an upgrade, but was, because inside was better, but outside it wasn't a pro body, it was a plastic body. And now it's a bit all over the place, but the D700 is a great camera. John says, glass more important than the camera. Yeah, I would say if you've got lenses that you're very, very happy with, then just, rather than upgrading the camera or jumping into a camera upgrade, think about what camera would benefit the lenses that I'm using, rather than changing all of your lenses to suit the body that you're about to change to. Kevin says, moving the focus point around on the Z6 works fine. I might have missed an earlier comment on that. Low light AF or any of those are hit and miss, yes. Although with all of the firmware updates and improvements to firmware on the Z cameras, that's one of the beauties of that system at the moment. Nikon do improve things like low light AF performance. But I would say that the DSLRs, because of their AF system being independent to the sensor, they tend to be slightly better for low light autofocus and fast moving subjects. Terry's happy with his D750 and 7000. Those are very nice combinations. I'm missing some comments. I'm going to just look earlier, and then I'm going to thank you all for contributing to the coffee fund, because I can see a lot of people did that while I was yammering on. Here we go. Z6, yeah, I mean, I will actually talk about the Z6 and the Z7 and the mirrorless cameras, but I'll do that in a separate stream, because I feel like they warrant their own stream. It's a very different system. 500, D800, yes, the colours, thank you, Philip, the colours from the D800 are lovely, and it's quite a revolution to go from an earlier body to something which has those 36 megapixels. Also, Nikon did a lot of color correction when they updated those cameras. So you will find that the pictures are truer to form. Some people said, oh, everything's a bit colder, but actually it's more truer to form than with the old D700, which made everything look nice and fluffy and warm. I found I was doing a lot of white balance correction on the D700. Lots of megapixels are addictive. Yes, particularly if you are a pixel peeper. If you kind of look at your picture and then you look at it 100% and then you try and zoom in a little bit more just to see if you can see every atom of the subject that you've taken pictures of, lots of pixels are great for that. When I did a review on the Z50, which is 20 megapixels, I found myself zooming in and then thinking, oh, it's not very clear, and then realizing that I'm used to shooting with a D850 and that's more than double the amount of resolution. So you just need to calm down and not zoom in quite so much. For most things, 20 megapixels is great. Oh, Michael had to buy a D200 in Florida when the shutter... Yeah, well, actually, D200 and D2X worked really nicely hand in hand, in fact. Hopefully, yeah, and then I've got a lot of comments about the sound being better. So I'm just going to skip through those. Thank you. All right, so now I want to just say a very quick thank you to everyone who contributed to the coffee fund today, which includes Ian, Terry, Mr. Hookshanks, Mike. I have to keep remembering. And was there anyone else? Yes, Gary, thank you. And Richard, thank you so much to all of you for contributing to the coffee fund, which I will go and partake of right now. If you have any questions about upgrading your cameras, Z9 will be over the top for pixels. 100 megapixels, Nick. I'm calling it now. Now, I really hope it isn't, because that's just going to kill all our hard drives. We're going to have to start stocking like 1 terabyte memory cards. That's another thing to think of, you know, memory card changes, all of that stuff is part of the process of changing over. So it can be quite painful. I like the Canon 2000D. No comment. Oh dear. I like the D300. I've shown you all the cameras I've used over the years. I've used a lot more than what I've shown you pictures from, but I have to say, there's nothing wrong with DX cameras at all. I like having one of each. I think that's a nice way to do it. If you can't, then just get the best that you need for the kind of photography that you do. You don't need to buy a D850 or a D6 to get fantastic shots. I was taking shots that I was very happy with a D200, and I think you can pick up a D200 now for about £100. So if that actually might be cheaper in some cases, possibly a bit more if if it's in nice condition. Thank you, Paul, as well. All right, so I will see you next Friday around the same time for another stream. As I said, you can always email me or drop a comment and we will answer as quickly as we possibly can. Virtual hugs to Diego. I'm sorry about the buzzing and the microphones. Might actually be the fan on the computer because it's also having a hard time. But anyway, I'm hope that it's fine. And for next week, I will check it again. I think it's a battery thing. Anyway, we'll see. So thank you, everybody. I will see you next Friday, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend and rest of next week. Take care. Bye.